Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Legal 500 and Bird and Bird webinar, the crumbling walls between professional and private life. My name is Yun Song Choi. I'm a research analyst at the Legal 500, and I'll be introducing today's session. Today's session will be around 60 minutes, and this afternoon, we are taking a deep dive into what you need to know about mitigating the legal and reputational risks arising from the blurred boundaries between professional and private life, and also the wider employment trends in general.
Thank you. Oh, Sarah, you too.
We have a fantastic panel ready to tackle today's topic. Joining us on our panel today, we have Anton Ut, a counsel for employment team in Bird and Bird, Brussels, and Fred Ashraf, a senior associate in the International HR Services Group in London at Bird and Bird, and Philip Franks, head of human resources, Benelux, France, Spain, and MENA for S3, and Francesca Belloso, head of people, global DCS at CBRE. Now I'll throw over to Anton to begin the session with an introduction to the effects of remote and flexible working on employee well-being and productivity. Anton?
Thank you, Yunson. So let's kick off today's session with our first topic, which is remote and flexible working. Flexible and remote working are evolutions long in the making that have been hugely accelerated by the coronavirus pandemic, with millions of employees being forced to work remotely from their homes. Both employees and employers have discovered the possibilities of teleworking. Now that most countries have lifted the COVID restrictions, employees can again work full-time from the office. However, we see that remote working is here to stay. Indeed, research by Gartner shows that 48% of employees will work remotely at least some days in the week, compared with 30% previously. The hybrid form of remote working, whereby the employee works a couple of days at the home and the rest of the week at the office, is the most popular one. This model allows companies to offer flexibility while also maintaining some of the benefits of office-based working. However, there's also companies that decided to close down their offices altogether and only offer remote working. These companies usually call upon a very international workforce and have employees in many different countries. They can benefit from the fact that they have access to a much larger pool of talent to recruit from. But also other companies sometimes offer remote working from abroad in so-called working from anywhere policies. The diverse legal landscape that applies in case of international remote working does make working remotely from anywhere a very complex exercise for employers. Company policies allowing working from anywhere are therefore at the same time often very restrictive. Remote working does have a big impact on the way work is organized. For employers, it's harder to supervise their employees. The distance makes it difficult to ensure that employees dedicate their working time to professional activities instead of free time activities such as online shopping, household chores, or entertainment. Trust and clear verifiable objectives are the preferred remedies. However, sometimes they prove insufficient. In that case, setting up some kind of monitoring system may be required, at least to eradicate the excesses. In setting up such a system, employers need to be mindful of the privacy and data protection legislation, and also other obligations, such as, for example, the requirement to consult the Works Council. But also for employees, remote working has had a big impact. Remote working offers flexibility to employees to better organize their private lives. By not having to comply with strict work schedules, employee can schedule private appointments, for example, during the office hour, or pick up their kids at school. The missed working time can be called up after office hours. This flexibility has led to the slow erosion of the clear boundaries between work and free time, For some employees, this can negatively impact their well-being. They have the feeling of being on call all the time, of having to reply to every email when it arrives, which can of course result in added stress. Some bank companies have therefore taken measures to protect the well-being of their employees by determining, for example, that employees have the right to be offline at certain hours, or that emails are no longer sent after a specific hour. In some countries, such as France, but also soon in Belgium, this right to disconnect has been included in specific legislation. To guide companies with their remote working policies, we at Bird & Bird have developed the Future of Remote Working Guide. This guide acts as an overview of issues relating to remote working across a number of countries, where key insights are identified for employers based on the international employment team's experience. The guide will be made available to all of you via the chat and via email. But now let's hear from our experts in the field and their experience with remote working. Philip, what have you observed is one of the unintended or unexpected consequences of remote and flexible working, whether positive or negative?
Thank you, Anton. Yeah, well, I must say, as you were introduced, is that indeed lots of things changed with the COVID, and things that appeared to be completely impossible 3 years ago became now a reality. So my major observation today would be that employees want to organize their working life around the life, and no more organize their life around the working requirements. And so that makes it a completely different mindset. So where we see more and more need for flexibility. And more concretely, I would say what we observed in the company since we implemented also, well, first we had a forced period of home working, of course, with the COVID, but then afterwards in September last year, we introduced the hybrid working mode for people to be able to work at least 50% from home. And if we look at our employee NPS scores, for example, so the engagement survey results, we see that well, we have the best results ever. We also see that the financial results of the companies and probably the economy was supporting this, but we see that our results are the best ever also. So, well, we can see a link between the engagement and the results of the company. And what I think that people really appreciate, and that's something that comes out also of the survey we do, is not specifically to be able to work from home, it's at least to have the choice to work from wherever they can best perform. In fact, is it from home, is it from the office, or in any other place? So first thing, observation I would say is these better results of engagement and financial results for the company. Second thing is that I see that since we introduced some flexibility, and it was not so obvious, because 3 years ago managers would not have thought people would work from home and be successful. Now everybody is forced to see that it works. So the observation that I see there is also that the more flexibility you introduce, the more flexibility people want. And of course, we have a young population that needs to take care of their children, but we have also people who need to take care of their parents. Huh? The population gets older, so this happens also, of course, also. And so we see now more and more requests for additional flexibility, like thinking about the 4 days week. That's, for example, in Belgium, where it's now a part of the legislation, but also remote working from abroad. We observed 2 years ago employees that were suddenly appearing on video conferencing in very exotic countries without us knowing it. So there, I agree with you that there needs to be some monitoring and some legal framework to fix this, because as an employer today, we really want to put this in our value proposition, but it needs to be in a certain compliant context also to protect the company and the employees. And finally, I would say the third observation is that not all the legislations, and I'm in charge of 6 countries, legislations are not harmonized, and sometimes the labor conditions are not yet flexible enough to answer the demand of the employees. If we see, for example, a classical contract of 40 hours per week, it's a little bit obsolete when people today, what they want is to be able to go to the gym from 10 to 12, for example, on the Monday morning, but to be able to work on a Sunday. And so this is a challenge that we are facing. So for me, these are the 3 major observations: better results, better engagement, request for more flexibility, and then the need for legal background or support that should be adapted.
I find that so interesting, the idea that the legislation is playing catch up and basically the market is just now driven by effectively employee expectations around remote work. Francisco, what about you? Because I know you have some industry perspectives as well. You know, is that similar to what you're seeing? Are there any other kind of knock-on effects that you've seen in leadership or any other areas?
Very similar to what Philippe just described. I would say, to build up in some of the points about the more flexibility to give, and also about the idea of having the choice, is exactly that. I think the whole paradigm of what is the traditional working week, I think that's disappearing, or maybe that's moving in a different direction. It's not any longer the classic Monday to Friday, you know, as the sample given. It may be more convenient for you that actually you don't work certain days in the week, but it's better for you, for your personal life or any commitments, to do on a weekend. And I think that what it brings is a whole shift on changes regarding cultural, you know, it's about that change that it goes with all of that. That's the main thing. And I would say that's the main observation regarding the leadership, because they may tend to be of a certain age, a certain background population in terms of race and gender. They may have a far more traditional view of what is a working week. And so therefore, I think as the new generations become leaders of the future, I'm hoping that that means as well that the whole paradigm of the classic week will change. In another hand, another point I want to make is about one size does not fit all, which is built in some of the comments by Philippe as well, that there's as well an element that we have observed is that need for reconnecting. You know, we were talking about this just before we went online. You may get a little bit of a overload, a Zoom overload, or using the camera or the phones or whatever. And let's not forget that. Let's go back to the focus of being here, showing my colors as a human resources professional, that it should be about the people. And one of the key things there is about communication, the elements of collaboration. And that's one of the things, for example, it have come out on our as well engagement survey, that we need to put back the focus on is that collaboration aspect, which perhaps may have been lost a little bit with the use of online tools, for example.
Thank you, Francisca, very interesting. Another question that came up was remote working presumes a lot of trust of the employer in its employees. And Philippe, do you have any recommendations on how to deal with any abuse of this trust? And how do you manage the performance of employees working abroad?
Well, it's of course trust is the basis of that whole system, and even if you don't want it, you are forced to trust the employees when they work remotely, and it's trust on both sides, I would say. Now, this requires, of course, a very clear code of conduct, and people have to know what are the expected behaviors Also, well, we have generally a code of conduct for behaviors internally in the office, but what about people working from home? Also, what are the code of conducts when you're on a video conferences? What is the dress code? Sometimes just people don't know. Do you put your camera on or off, or when? So all these things need to be very clear. Now, I would say managing performance is not that different. It's just that you need to trust that people will achieve their targets, and if you still continue giving clear targets to people and clear expectations of what behaviors you expect, normally that they should not be problems. Coming back to the trust, something we implemented, for example, in one of my countries, is a self-managed team. So that's a quite interesting experience also in trust, because there is no more hierarchy that decides at the end. It's a collective decision-making process, which makes also that misbehavior or gross misconduct or whatever will be automatically penalized by the peers. It's peer pressure that will make that at the end everybody behaves like in line with the values of the company and the code of conduct. So I would say that would be my advice. And of course, the role of leadership there is key. Huh? So the attitude of leaders is important. And well, we had to train our people also in terms of leading people remotely and developing that trust with team members. So some managers that were used to do micromanagement, for example, had some more difficulties. So it's a whole journey that we did with management, mostly to be able to make it work. And well, as I said, the results are good. So we see that performance management is going the right way as well in this context.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Philip. It's interesting because from the legal perspective, we are seeing an increase in sort of grievances and disputes around the virtual environment in a way that maybe we didn't before. So a lot more reliance on kind of somebody said this to me in a chat, I can prove it, or you know, they were inappropriate on this call and I can't prove it because nobody was there, but it was just a Zoom call. We were the only two in the call and it wasn't right. So it's interesting because it has a knock-on effect on kind of employee investigations, if you like. But Francisca, I wanted to ask you, have you got a similar experience in terms of performance management? And do you think there are any changes people are implementing to basically be a bit tighter on some of those aspects, you know, objectives, things like that?
Yeah, quite rightly. I think it's about, it may be that we may be redundant or stating the obvious. I think we need to be more explicit on those rules, even if you may feel that you are over communicating. And that's, as an example, what I tend to do for my team. My typical style is definitely no micromanaging, but sometimes I tend to move towards that because I did observe that I need to be even more explicit on my communication on what are the boundaries, in line with what Philippe just mentioned. I think the main point is about, you know, far more clear communications, clear setting up very clear expectations. What are the boundaries? What is actually acceptable or not? You know, especially like Philippe and I, we got many different cultures and different ways of doing things. So what it may be perfectly acceptable in a particular country environment is horrifying for someone else. Mm-hmm. So that brings the element of making sure that we equip our managers to deal with that. So we are expecting our managers almost to be superheroes and our leaderships, which they should. However, we have a responsibility as well to give them the capabilities, the skills, so they can, you know, develop those skills to give that safer space. I call it, to set up the boundaries in a way that is understood in the multicultural differences that both Philippe and I operate, and also be inclusive, you know, eliminating the bias, and that's important as well. And one thing, for example, we do in our organization is that it's something we call D&I moment, and basically it's just a short bits where either before we start a meeting or when we are doing a session where we make a point to call out anything specific. And that could be simple as, I don't know, the use of pronouns or the use of a particular language, you know, or are we interrupting the people when they are talking, or are we creating that safe space for people in different cultures? They may not feel that they can interrupt and talk, so therefore we are giving them the opportunity to contribute. So sometimes it's not about doing big flashy things, and a believer of small changes but sustainable, that would be far much better.
Thank you, Francisca. Something we've all already touched about is the impact of remote working on the employees' well-being, and then more specifically, the impact on the work-life balance with no fixed working hours anymore and everything kind of going through each other. So working time, free time, so there's no strict boundaries anymore. Are there any specific measures that you take to protect employees' well-being and their private life?
Well, very just similar to what we just described, there's very clear guidelines of what is acceptable or not, like some, you know, meetings etiquette to start with, as I just described a minute ago. I think it's important going back to creating that safe space that where the employees can set up as well their boundaries. If you've got a family or you have, you know, what is happening in France and other countries, that right to disconnect without feeling that you are going to be punished, or in the sense that is that going to impact my career. So I think it needs to be very clearly that, you know, maybe, you know, educate all of us as well on time management skills. And also it's not about the presence on how I am on camera and at the office, it's about what I am producing, you know, the contributions at the value I'm adding. So, and I think as well, because on the life of today, which technology is here, and it's not only our work, it's at home, you know, anyone who has children or sons and daughters of certain age, doesn't really matter. We are all, you know, kind of glue to our screens. So that brings an element of education in terms of how we educate ourselves to ensure that we are getting that disconnection space where it gives us time to absorb what we are listening and hearing all the time, and therefore we can process it and create out of that. Sometimes it's not enough time, it's meeting after meeting after meeting. So I think it's just some basic etiquette that we could all educate. So therefore we can create that safe space to say, this is it. An example from my end that I do with my own team is I make a conscious effort not to email anyone at all, however urgent. I mean, if it's urgent, I just call them, right? And so they will know, they will have to pick up. But if I send an email, I'm sending already a message that I'm expecting them to reply to me, or at least that could be the perception that they may be getting. So therefore, sometimes we all need to send those emails because we feel I'm going to forget, or it's in my list of things to do. Well, Microsoft have a wonderful things where you just call time when the message will go out. So you get your list of tick, but then your team, you will know if that's going to someone in France or someone in another country, it's an appropriate time when that person will see. So I think, again, maybe it's going back to make sure that rather than letting the technologies dominate our life, maybe turn that around as an opportunity, and maybe technology that equally impact our well-being and our mental well-being, then use that in our favor. For example, like all those apps that are around about, you know, having some meditation, which we offer for free as well, and I'm sure many organizations do. So I think we have an obligation to facilitate all the tools that we can internally available to ensure that employees can choose what is more suitable for them to aid, and also don't assume, ask what works best for you on your circumstance.
Thanks, Francesca, I wanted to change tack slightly now and talk a little bit about employee activism. So, it's not something that's new. We've seen it through traditional forms of collective action in Europe and through other types of informal action in the UK for some time. Research from Weber Shandwick shows that nearly 38% of employees report that they've spoken up to criticise their employer's actions over a controversial issue that affects society. And it's definitely something that the pandemic has catalysed, and we've sort of seen it take on a bit of a new face. The COVID period, really highlighted some of the racial and gender inequalities, and that activism has sort of spread. It's now engaging political issues like the war in Ukraine, racial justice issues, climate concerns, and those are just a few of the topics where we've seen these examples. And then how people take action is also different. So mass walkouts, high-profile resignations, a single tweet, and that can turn into something which is a massive problem, or even concerted sort of social media campaigns by employee groups. So employee expectations of the employer are definitely changing. We've also seen a new strand, and I think it's clear that employees' personal lives, and specifically their values, are now impacting how they engage with work. So the importance of ethics in business has emerged quite strongly in the pandemic, and following, employers effectively forcing their leadership to consider how their operations might impact society around them. And that's been where collective action's been quite successful. And the examples that are out there show that effectively employers can't take business decisions that are inconsistent with their values because they'll be challenged. I think social media is another area where, this has sort of contributed to overall activism. So we've got internal tools for collaborations, but then simply people's personal accounts. And in the pandemic era, when everyone's been at home, that's also changed the landscape, because they can post something in the day and no one's, they're not doing it in front of everyone. And I think employees have really realized that kind of mobilization of staff on social media can be fast, it can be quite effortless, it can be anonymous. And when you've got a fast moving business, they know that putting confidential information out there into the public domain is something that's actually a bit more effective than going through the internal processes. And so you have this situation where a single voice is actually quite powerful, and we've definitely seen that. It's interesting, and I want to hear from the speakers on this, but cultural differences are quite notable. In countries where there are formal employee representation structures, activism on an individual level is probably less common. Discrimination legislation maybe plays a part too. So in the UK, a discrimination claim, the compensation for that is uncapped. But perhaps in Europe, unjustified termination is something that carries more value. So I'll be interested to talk to the panel about that, given they operate, on a global level. And then just the second thing is really that, coupled with this rise in activism, and I don't think the two are disconnected, there's been this growing emphasis in UK and US headquartered businesses on D&I. And there's a clear link there. So, if employers are serious about having a diverse workforce, they need to be prepared to embrace a diverse set of views and opinions. And, as we're seeing this trend of encouraging employees to bring their whole selves to work, that also includes their nationality, their race, their beliefs, their values. So I think that's really interesting. And although the prominence of D&I issues is increasing in Central Europe, that's largely being driven by the discourse around this topic in UK and US headquartered businesses. And for a number of reasons, the D&I agenda isn't progressing in the same way in Central and Eastern Europe as it is in the US and the UK. And that can often be attributed to a greater degree of separation between personal and professional life, although we're obviously saying that's now crumbling. And it'll be interested to see if that will change. At this moment, obviously, D&I efforts are usually focused in Europe on gender equality, and the kind of official reporting and legislation around that. But I think businesses are having to navigate that tension between a global agenda and the local challenges. And sometimes the local response is essentially it's different here and what you're doing is not culturally acceptable or viable. And sometimes they have legitimate reasons for that, sometimes they're not. Perhaps the relevant Works Council has other priorities. Perhaps there's data privacy limits on the collection of diversity data. Maybe public policy is inconsistent with what you want to do, and that's going to have an impact on your business. Perhaps employee feedback, or and how much they're willing to disclose is simply just not at the level that you want it to be, or that it might be elsewhere. I mean, there's a whole host of reasons. And on that point, our firm has produced a great resource in relation to sort of collecting diversity data across a number of jurisdictions. So for any HR directors or legal counsel grappling with that, we will share the link in the chat. But to sum up, the reason all of this is important is because it does have a direct impact on corporate brand and reputation. And as these walls and boundaries that we've been talking about between the personal and the private, the personal and the professional are coming down, employees care more and more about these issues. And we'll talk about talent and attraction and retention later, but increasingly, I think employees want to know what their employer stands for. So I want to kind of go back to the speakers now. And Francisca, I wanted to ask you in particular, how do you think employee expectations have really changed over the last few years? And what's different now about how they're kind of mobilizing and raising this collective voice?
Very much what you just described, in the sense that there's a huge expectations from the employees for employers to respond to whatever is happening in the world, which in a way, from the personal point of view, I understand you need to do that, what I call it, the context, and going back to my initial comments about we are dealing with people, so the people don't park anything and then just come to work and do that, so that's one of the elements. I think a couple of comments there or make key points is that, yes, is a strong commitment or expectations from the employees that the employer should commit and respond to that, because therefore they will feel that it's in alignment with their values and that sense of belonging in general, and that touch into the talent acquisition and retention that you just allude to.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Sorry to interrupt you, but it's interesting, isn't it, that the cases that we've seen where people have tried not to say anything or said that, the work is not, for politics, we've seen a reaction to that in some jurisdictions where people have sort of either left or.
Exactly, and I had some examples of that when, depending on the situation of the client, they said, you need to add on that. Well, no, this employee, it's my duty to protect them. Yeah, they may have a particular opinion, but that's it, it's their opinion at the end of the day, and I may agree or disagree, or you as a client. But I think that's an element of that, is how far is the obligation of an employer to solve the problems of the world. I think rather than that is the obligation of the employer is to how we react and how we address that in the way that it may impact our employees. That's where it's important. And it brings the point about, it means that whatever we do under the D&I, because otherwise it becomes cosmetic, as I normally say, it becomes really embedded into what we do as a sustainable action, rather than just be, oh, hi, nice, tick, tick. From the branding perspective, it looks very pretty. However, when the fad is over, so what? And the employees can see through that very clearly. And I think we shouldn't underestimate that. And that goes back to the point about the talent acquisition and retention, that when we are doing interviews and attracting them, they will ask very intelligent questions. Doesn't really matter their social or educational background, because of the availability of the information out there, the people are quite well informed because that's something that they feel passionate about. So therefore, they're expecting the organizations that if they are doing it, they're saying they're going to do it, prove it and show it to me, not just on a nice branding exercise, doing a lovely, Pride Month. It's about, okay, how I am performance management, I talking to people, I'm doing things, or creating that space is that inclusive of all the race, and or gender or all the other characteristics. So I think that's what is important really here. And I think that's why, for example, in our organizations, the employee resourcing groups are very successful and very strong. And I think without really being activists, but it's in a way, because we are leaving to them, we are giving them full ownership, of they are, for example, the ones that they organize International Women's Day or now Pride, or because that's something they feel passionate about that, so they even have a budget, they even are giving they're accountable for that. So that's a way as well, in a way, to say, okay, we cannot do everything, but we are asking you, you feel passionate about that, do something about that as well, help us, educate us as well as an organization.
And I think when it's employee-led as well, you kind of, you know, it's helpful because actually you're kind of including your workforce to start off with, but also I think you're giving them the space to do that within your organization, so they then don't feel they're not being listened to and need to go externally, which is obviously some of the activist issues that kind of we deal with day to day. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned D&I, I wanted to ask you a question on that. So the D&I agenda, I know you're kind of heavily involved where you are, but how do you think that what we're talking about here, which is this idea of personal and private life and keeping them separate, and that now being increasingly blurred, how does that sort of impact what we're doing in D&I, in your organization? And have you seen a difference across some regions or countries? And yeah, could you just tell us a bit more about that?
Well, yes, it's true. It's a lot of difference across countries. I think you allude to that earlier as well, to those cultural differences to regards, for example, to race, that it seems to be led as race is a problem or an issue, something to solve in this world, only in the UK and the United States. Now, how we look in Europe, do we have a problem on race or no? That's a big question, because if you ask any European, they will say, no, of course not. We don't have any problem. But actually, I think personally, we do. It's just becoming invisible. People that they are not the classic European, they become invisible. And I think that's something. So if we, and in the same way we're talking about race between UK and the United States, it's a different dynamic, it's a different aspect there. So we, again, reusing the wording earlier about one size does not fit it all. We may have the sentiment of, yes, we need to address race, or we need to address the impact on, a woman, or, the gender, but how's that impact in different countries is different. However, women, I think, is quite, unique across, because going back to the point about, the fact of the pandemic and the flexible working and all of that relating to D&I, one thing is really has come up to light in how much has impacted specifically gender inequality. Because one thing that we forget is actually the work done by women, that it gets unpaid and again invisible, is the work we do at home. So I'm not saying men don't do. However, as a generalist, in general terms, the reality of the life is that the work that we all do at home is unpaid and invisible. And I think that's the biggest inequality that the whole flexible working, because it tends to be, I think one study I did in a previous organization is, and surveys, is that the majority of the people who were probably 90% requesting flexible working, guess who were? Female employees. Why no men?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think there's definitely a correlation. And Philip, I wanted to know kind of if you're seeing a similar thing, because I think it's being termed leadership proximity bias, which is basically that, in some organizations you have the leaders coming into the office and they basically give the opportunities to whoever they see. And if, as Francisca says, women are going to be increasingly working from home, or even not necessarily women, but those with caring responsibilities, perhaps they have disabled members of their family, we have seen some correlation in this. So there's a risk of a bias and a disadvantage. Is that something you've observed in the context of sort of inclusion and anything kind of you think that can be done to address that? Mute.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's as you mentioned, the role of leadership is essential, because if leaders preach that well, everybody can work flexible and from home, but they are in the office every day, unconsciously people will know that they have to come to the office also. So I think what is important there is, well, we have a very strong D&I policy, and it goes also beyond just the gender or ethnicities. We see in our population, for example, that we want to be really inclusive also for parents. We know how difficult it was for young parents, for example, during the COVID period. So we introduced care days so that they can take care of their children or any other caring topic that they would have, so that people can just take additional free days to take care of their families, for example. Now, we created, as Francisca mentioned, resource groups of young parents, for example, so that they can share best practices and really focus on the inclusive aspect of D&I, because that's something which is not always very well understood by management. So how can you be an inclusive manager? And also it's sometimes just in the vocabulary that you use, or saying good afternoon to someone who is living at 4 o'clock, for example, is not acceptable anymore. So we pay attention to diversity, as I said, not only in terms of gender, for example, but also on people that are working part-time, or people that just needs to stay home for parents. And as I mentioned in the beginning, once you have clear targets and code of conduct, I mean, everybody can find him or herself in this organization. So leadership attitude is key, but then really looking at all the potential differences that we might have in the population, and making sure that we train our managers. That's part of the journey I mentioned earlier also, is to train our manager to that changes in organizations today, and working on trust, and not anymore working on presence in the office. So again, it's working where you best perform, and wherever you are. Our motto is to say, well, everybody is welcome at S3, and we really mean it. So the way, of course, you measure that is difficult, because some people probably feel forced to come to the office. And it was the case at the beginning of hybrid working, because managers were not used to it. But as we see good results now, well, it's easier, of course, to convince manager to trust their team, and having more flexibility in their team. So we do regular surveys also, at least once per quarter. We do some pulse surveys to just have a feeling of how people feel in the organization. We have lots of focus groups where people can express themselves. And I agree on the fact that having internal forums where people can express themselves is the best way to just cope with bad reputation on social networks. It's having that proximity with employees, so that they can really talk directly with management. We have lots of leaders also who have organized these 15 minutes meetings with employees. So just really being sometimes working more remotely, but at the same time very close to people.
Yeah, I'm hearing a lot about employee engagement, and just also kind of inclusion being a great focus. I'll hand over to you, Anton, now to look more at contingent workforce.
Yeah, thank you for that. Something that's a bit different, but also a very interesting topic we wanted to discuss is the increased use of contingent worker and flexible employment. We see that our clients, they tell us that they're really looking for greater workforce flexibility. And as this flexibility is sometimes difficult to achieve with just hiring regular employees, also because of the rigid labor legislation that applies to normal employees, they call upon more flexible contingent workers. These contingent workers, they can take up different forms. You have normal agency work, you have outsourcing, for example. You have newer players in the field, such as professional employers organizations or employers of record, that hire employees on their payroll and then lease them out to you as a client. You have other service providers, or you can call upon the services of independent contractors. Companies may have different reasons to call upon contingent employer. For example, the need of more flexibility to cover off and on peak periods. The nature of the work may also result in requiring a lot of flexibility. There are, of course, the cost-saving reasons. Another possibility is, for example, they're looking for a specialization that is not present in-house, or they might simply just try to avoid the administrative and compliance burden that an employer has and company employers are confronted with. They often also call upon contingent workers if they wish to hire talent in a country where they have no presence. And here the idea is really to avoid having to deal with all the compliance issue and the administrative burden of starting operations in a country with a legal system they're not acquainted with. There are, however, inherent risks with using contingent workers. The use of employment structures is often strictly regulated in national law. Labor leasing activities sometimes require a permit or a special authorization. Moreover, there's the risk of a requalification, which is, I think, often the biggest risk, is that the contingent worker would be requalified into an employee, and more than that, an employee of the client. So he will become your employee, which can have really a serious financial impact for the company. And service providers offering these contingent worker services, they sometimes promise the degree of employers' risks that they can take over that is not, that they cannot achieve in practice. And also some of these structures may not be permitted in national law. And companies that have not well informed themselves, they end up with a check basically. Rules and regulation also vary from one country to another, and it gets really complex when you use contingent workers in an international employment context. For companies dealing with cross-border employment structures, we have developed an interactive heat map looking at the risks in different countries. These risks are present in the field of employment law, but also tax law, social security law, labor leasing. But what is sometimes also overlooked is the enforceability of restrictive covenants in another country, confidentiality and intellectual property legislation and provisions, and the data protection risks. The map helps employers to select the employment structure most appropriate for employment needs in a specific country. Again, we will share the map, the link to the map via the chat and via email. There's a trend both in legislation as in case law to tighten the rules on contingent labor. In a lot of EU countries, I've seen case law dealing with questions where gig economy workers, such as, for example, delivery riders, are self-employed workers or in fact employees. And in 2019, the EU has also issued a directive on transparent and predictable working conditions. This directive provides in some minimum rights for all workers in more precarious jobs, such as the right to information on the essential aspects of the work, anti-abuse regulations for zero-hour contracts, for example, and the right to receive any mandatory training they need without cost. The directive needs to be implemented by the 1st of August 2022. However, as usual, a lot of countries within the EU will not make the deadline. When applied within the legal boundaries, contingent workers are still a very good option to ensure flexibility. Notwithstanding the trend to stricter legislation, if we listen to our clients, contingent employment stays very popular and its popularity is even increasing. So how are companies in practice dealing with contingent workers and flexible work arrangements. A lot of questions we can ask our experts in the field. And Francesca, I see that you're back. How do you think that flexible working has impacted the talent attraction of employees?
Well, in our case, it's slightly different. It's more in line with one of your discussions about the business service providers, rather than being contingency workers per se. But the challenges are the same because, as you mentioned, that's part of our business value proposition to the client, the fact that we're taking, that pain away, managing the employment related to that individual, and we are promising you that this individual or group of individuals are undertaking these numbers of services and they are going to be on site. Now, how can we then, balance out the needs for flexible working versus the commitments that we may have done to a client? So that's what it brings sometimes a challenge there. Plus, as you mentioned, the risks regarding co-employment. At the moment, that there is a matter like that, it could be, a disagreement or a conflict there. So I think for us, that's the main thing. I mean, a typical example, as I mentioned, we recently just got our employee engagement survey, and one of the questions it was about that we asked the employees about, okay, how often do you want to come to the office? What is your preference in terms of working 3, 2, 1 day at the office on site? And we got really interesting comments precisely for some of our employees, what we call embedded, and typically our engineers, that they are based on site, say, well, hold on a second, this is irrelevant to me. What do you mean with this question? Because I'm on site. So that is going to create some uncomfortable, I would say, how we're going to manage that messaging back to the business. And I think for us, that's what, some of the things that we will need to factor in on how to manage that as appropriated.
Thank you. We also have a real expert on contingent labor here, with S3 being very active in the field of contingent labor. What do you think are the trends you're seeing within companies with their reliance on contingent and flexible labor structures?
Yeah, it's true. A big part of our activity is indeed to provide contingent workforce to our clients, and we, well, as I mentioned, our results are the best ever. So on one side, probably through a better employee engagement, but also to the market conditions. And as you mentioned, Anton, there is a need from our clients from various sectors to have more flexibility, but also to work in a more agile way and on a project base. So then, of course, contingent work is a good answer to that. And at the same time, well, we know that people also need more flexibility to organize work around their life. So the combination of two, I think, makes that, and we analyze a lot of trends in terms of future of work, that we see that there is a trend really going to more freelancers work. There are also surveys that indicate that a lot of people above 50 are quitting their job to go to a more freelancer way, because, well, today also the search for purpose is important, and people want to enjoy life simply. So that's also from the individual's point of view, it's also an answer to additional flexibility than when you're linked to a company. So I think that's a major trend. So companies working more agile and people who want more flexibility. So this is a really good opportunity to have a combination of both, I think, which explains that we see more and more freelancers on the market. And then it depends sometimes also on the company culture. I have 6 countries in my remit, and it's true that some countries are probably more used to flexibility, like in the Netherlands, for example, who really have a market of contingent Some other countries are still more traditional, but we see the trends increasing almost everywhere.
Yeah, thank you. There's indeed a huge increase of the demand and also the supply of flexible labor. But Francesca, do you see any limits around flexible labor as a company?
No, really. I think it will be more about we will need to evolve as a business, and it's depending very much on what will be the requirements of the clients, similar to a little bit what Philippe just mentioned. Because this is going to be part of the value proposition that we offer to the clients. It's about managing as well the expectations and what we're selling, staying to them and communicating clearly. Otherwise, we may end up some conflict. So I think this is going back to that, to the basics in a way.
Thanks, Francisca. I wanted to move on now. Just I'm conscious of time, but in the context of that, actually, one of the consequences around the business. I think that there has been an impact of flexible working on business protection and information security. So, we've talked about the modern workplace moving away from this 9-to-5 physical office. There's a lot more remote working. And that revolution, if you like, presents one key challenge around protecting trade secrets and confidential information. And employees, whether intentional or otherwise, they can often act in breach of that duty, whether it's during their employment or afterwards, and the cost of that can be quite significant to the employer if they need to then address any competitive advantage that the employee might have. This has always been sort of high on the agenda. I remember there was a pre-pandemic survey that was quite alarming, where it said almost 50% of employees have left with confidential information, which I think makes most legal counsel and HR directors sweat a little bit. But I think it's right that it's getting sort of renewed attention, because the pandemic period has really changed the way we work. And what we saw is at the beginning of the pandemic, everyone was sort of hurriedly adapting their IT systems so they could actually just work, that nobody really thought about data security necessarily. And we saw this spike in sort of cyber attacks and breaches. And then we kind of, have slowly started playing catch up on this, but we have to consider the security of that data and robust protection. So if we look at confidential information, you can see clearly why the hybrid model is kind of going to, increase some of these trends. So employees are taking information between the home and the office. That data could be lost or stolen. Staff could leak that information at home, whether it's deliberate or by accident. The idea of having this physical distance from the workplace means that employees aren't also as aware of the confidential nature of the information. So, sometimes if you do have employees in this contingent workforce, they might be working for multiple employers and they're on the same systems, and they could share information effectively just without even realizing. And then you've got those that deliberately want to use it. They're no longer visible to the organization, so they can do some of that at home. The idea of being able to see someone on CCTV running out the office with the documents is kind of long gone now, and it's much more discreet than that. And similarly, at the end of employment, kind of remote working, it stops the employer from being able to act as quickly. So being able to sort of say, have you returned everything? In some ways the relationship ends quite quickly, and actually employers may sort of inadvertently be encouraging some of these risks, because they're promoting this culture of constant communication and collaboration, and that might encourage employees to share informations on all these informal channels rather. So Francisca, I'm conscious of time. I just wanted to ask you a quick question around that point, data security in your organization, and whether there's really been a renewed focus on that.
It always has been a high focus anyway in both organizations, that the current one and the one I have been at a few months ago, because of the nature of the business is very highly regulated anyway. So therefore it is already intrinsic, well embedded, that automatically any new hire, regardless their role and their level, there's a minimum of security training and guidance that we have to be compliant, and that also is done on an annual basis to kind of force you to renew that training online, purely mainly because of a nature of a business, of a regulation, but actually serves the purpose of what you just described. So that hasn't been a great change on that. Yes, it's more of a risk, and what it means that we are being more insistent on that, what I call continuous education, you know, but it's something that it was there, so it hasn't been a huge change purely because of the nature of a business.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the other area, of course, is post-termination restrictive covenants. And I know the rules vary sort of widely across Europe, but as the competition for that talent becomes fiercer, you know, we are seeing trends of people kind of agreeing to waive those restrictions, or sometimes even taking a really aggressive stance because they just need to retain their own talent and they don't want them going to competitors. I think working from anywhere policies are also very tricky when it comes to post-termination restrictions, because what's the geographic restriction of that location? So I think onboarding procedures, offboarding procedures, those are really important in a way that they weren't as important before. But reviewing the scope of the restrictions and having effective training is really important. I finally, just in the last few minutes, I wanted to turn to this idea of talent attraction and retention and how that links to flexible working. So I'll ask you briefly, Francisca, and then I'll ask you as well, Philip.
And I know I need to go.
Just quick really about whether flexible working has impacted talent attraction.
Totally, you know, have become part of what is called now the employee value proposition. So the classic, what we call reward packages, or together with the benefits, those classic benefits are no longer the same. So being able to offer that flexibility in any shape and form, because there are many different forms there, that's part now of that offering. And I mentioned that is the day that if you look in any employment board, you will see that it comes now with the tag hybrid or remote or office.
What's the flexible working policy? Tell us, yeah.
Exactly. So that's very much a typical thing that it comes at the front of any offer there, and it's very much part of that value proposition. So that classic, compensation package is now having a different look.
Particularly in recruitment. Philip, I wanted to ask you then, for existing employees and effectively those kind of who you want to retain and keep in your organization, we're moving away from pay and benefits as a retention tool. So how does flexible working impact there?
Well, I would say it's even not a question. You need to have it. It's the same as a good salary level. The people would not understand that you don't have at least hybrid working possibilities. And it's flexibility around every topic. So we speak a lot also today about mobility, for example. So the new ways of working have also requested new mobility options to offer to the employees. It's no more a company car, but having different options. It's also being flexible in the benefits that you can choose. So people really look for a tailor-made approach, not a one-size-fits-all. And really feel like individuals caring for, and not one in the massa. So that's really important in the way we treat employees.
Yeah, it's interesting what you mentioned earlier about the sort of caring days, because that's not something we would have necessarily seen previously, but I can see it's very much a talent attraction and retention tool, because it's something you're offering that's different to pay, but actually very valuable for employees that have those responsibilities. So, and I think we're seeing it slowly. I saw recently Spain has introduced the menstruation leave, and we're seeing these effectively these softer ways. And I think it all feeds into this idea that your personal life is now part of your professional life. So if you are, as a woman, on your period, then that comes into your work as well. So I think kind of it's really interesting to hear some of these trends, actually, because I think it is just getting fiercer and fiercer, this competition for talent. And I think our clients certainly are trying lots of new innovative ways of retaining people and putting policies out there. Sometimes we have to say this really won't work, across the board. But I think it's definitely something that's increasing.
Exactly, and also the need for ethical values, and we offer, for example, also 5 days for voluntary work. So all these things are as valued as the compensation package that you may have today.
Completely,
also.
yeah, because it allows them to integrate their personal life into
exactly.
this.
Yeah.
I just wanted to turn to some of the audience questions now. I can see that we have one from the audience, and Philip, I think it's appropriate for you actually, given S3's where they operate, but it's really what sort of opportunities are business leaders seeing in the transition to hybrid work. I mean, yours is very specific because of the nature of the business, but more broadly, are you seeing leadership kind of embrace this? And what are the opportunities there?
It's a good question. It's hybrid working, as I say, it's today, it's a fact. It's not a question anymore. So you need to have it, and the more flexibility you can offer, the more attractive you will be. Now we are also taking this as an opportunity to extend in the context of war for talent, where it's very difficult in some countries to find new people. It's a way to look much broader, to recruit people from other countries. As Anton mentioned, also we are considering having employees in countries where we don't have offices, for example, and so that could lead also to work with contingent workforce, having the right legal structure to be able to have people in these countries. So it's the real major opportunity I see there is really to broaden the potential type of candidates that we could find on the markets to reach additional talents.
It's really interesting. I actually had a question myself, because just out of interest, for Anton, and it's interesting because we've talked a lot about well-being of employees and the focus on effectively mental health and having the distinction and being able to turn your phone off. In the UK, that's sort of being regulated by the fact that employees are expecting, significant mental health and well-being policies from their employer. But obviously in Belgium, the right to disconnect law has been passed. So I just wanted to see, Anton, really where that was at and how you see it having an impact.
Yeah, the law has not been passed yet.
Sorry.
The proposal is there, and it has been
Proposal.
communicated already to the public. But it's like a lot, once things get communicated, other parties get involved in Belgium and they start discussing it. So the unions have another opinion, and then employers' organizations still have another opinion. So it still can drag on for a couple of months even.
It's really interesting, because it's definitely there in France, isn't it? And I think in Canada, I remember it's quite new in Canada. So I remember getting an email from Canadian Council sort of saying, how does this work in France? Because it's just started here, and what does it really mean?
The idea in Belgium is that every company, as from 20 employees, will need to have a policy really on the right to disconnect and off and on working hours. So probably will be quite similar to what you have in the UK, that these things are in policies. Yeah.
Do you think there will be any enforcement kind of consequences, like if you don't enforce the policy? Because I can see kind of culture sort of taking over. Even if there's a policy, if your boss is asking you to stay online, you're going to do it.
But probably there will not be like a real sanction included in the law, but the employee will probably just be entitled when when an email arrives after hours to just not answer the email, or when a call arrives just to not answer the calls. And that as an employer, you cannot attach any kind of sanctions to the fact that the employee did not respond to the email after office hours. That's probably the main sanction. It's how to enforce this in practice is of course difficult, because you You have to link the act that a certain employer did towards an employee with the fact that he did not reply to an email late at night. So
yes, interesting.
always
Quite
difficult
tricky,
to enforce. Yeah.
tricky areas. So I
But
think, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No,
Philip.
again, I think what is important and attractive to employees is having the choice of the freedom of choice, and that
That's the
I'm
thing,
not penalized if I
over-regulating.
don't answer. Exactly.
And
So
it's
there
weird.
is some legal framework, but giving the choice to employees and the freedom that maybe they can send it on a Sunday and they're completely happy, but that you don't annoy them on the Monday morning, for example, with of course a certain guidelines and rules. Otherwise,
Yeah,
it
it's
becomes
almost
very
like
chaotic.
a risk of over-regulation to protect employees might risk
Exactly,
the
yeah.
flexibility. So it's definitely a tricky one. I'm conscious of time, and I think we are going to wrap up now. So just on my behalf, a huge thank you to our speakers, Philip and Francisca and Anton, obviously always for working with me on this. But I'm going to hand back over to Yunson now to wrap us up.
Yeah, thank you so much. And that's all we've got for time. So as I mentioned in the chat, we will also email the additional resources after this chat. So please check mailbox. And if you have any issue, please let us know. Thank you very much. And we'll see you next time.